Max Verstappen has now reached the point where this no longer feels like the frustration of just one driver. After Japan, what he said shook all of Formula 1, because he did not only criticize the rules, he made it feel like if the sport keeps moving in this direction, even his own future could come under question. When the most important driver on the grid speaks like that, the story moves far beyond normal paddock drama. The problem is that this warning is not driven by emotion alone. Oliver Bearman's heavy crash at Suzuka made real the fear drivers had already been talking about. The pressure on the FIA is no longer just to bring a few small fixes. The pressure is to prove that the 2026 package is still worthy of Formula 1. And when such a major warning comes from Verstappen, the entire story naturally begins to revolve around him. That is why this is not just another story built around one angry quote. This is the moment where the sport has to decide whether it will admit its mistake or keep defending it. And the most dangerous part is that some people saw this mess coming a long time ago. This crisis did not begin at Suzuka. When the 2026 rules were launched, they were sold as the future of Formula 1. Smaller cars, active aero, sustainable fuel, and a new power unit formula designed to attract names like Audi and Cadillac. On paper, it all looked modern and exciting, but even at that stage, drivers like Max Verstappen were already saying that this package did not feel right for racing. That means the problem was not created by the crash. It was already inside the system. Christian Horner was also uncomfortable with this direction. While the tone from the Mercedes side at the time was far more dismissive, now that Mercedes have come out of the opening phase of the season with an edge, and Kimi Antonelli has taken the championship lead, that earlier debate suddenly looks much more important. What once sounded like fear is now starting to show up on the results sheet as well. That is why those earlier driver warnings matter so much in hindsight. From here, the story gets deeper, because once a regulation cycle begins to favor one team from the start, the debate stops being only about safety or feel. It becomes political, and that is exactly where the numbers started showing what words alone could not fully explain. The biggest flaw in the 2026 rules is that the car does not deliver its performance in a natural way. On paper, the power figure sounds impressive, running close to around 1,000 horsepower in total, which makes these cars sound like monsters. But the real problem is not peak power. The problem is the shape of that power across the lap and how quickly it falls away. To the driver, the car can feel like it is in full attack one moment, then suddenly being held back by its own energy profile the next. The new balance between the internal combustion side and the electrical side has made straight line behavior awkward. A driver can launch onto a straight with strong push, only for that shove to flatten out before the braking zone. So the car is not simply fast or slow, it becomes unpredictable, and when the shape of performance is that unstable, the natural flow of racing breaks apart. That is something fans cannot fully feel on television. But inside the cockpit, the driver understands it immediately. That is why the issue became bigger than lap time. It is no longer just about who is fastest. It is about where a car will lose energy, where another car will gain relative speed, and at what point two drivers will arrive at the same section with completely different speed states. That is where the driver reaction started getting louder. What made this story feel explosive was the fact that the complaints came from different garages, but the conclusion sounded the same. Verstappen raised the issue on a personal level, almost as if he was asking whether the sport was still worth the sacrifice. Lando Norris attacked the cockpit feeling. Fernando Alonso judged this whole direction against the standard of driving that makes Formula 1 special. Charles Leclerc exposed the frustration from the qualifying side. George Russell accepted the need for safety changes, and Kimi Antonelli, despite his early success, also made it clear that even the leading car does not feel natural with this package. The most important thing was that each driver described the problem from a slightly different angle. One focused on the straight line drop, another on the overall behavior of the car, another on the qualifying logic, and another on the identity of racing itself. When that many experienced drivers are circling around the same core issue, it becomes very hard for the FIA to dismiss it as normal noise. It stops looking like random frustration and starts looking like a pattern. And once it becomes a pattern, the story moves beyond media quotes. Then the real question becomes what drivers are saying in private. That was the next layer, and it made the pressure far more dangerous. The public comments were only one part of it. The real heat was building behind the scenes. Teams, engineers, and drivers were all seeing different pieces of data and having different experiences, but the direction they pointed to was very similar. Andrea Stella was one of the people pushing the issue openly. Carlos Sainz carried extra weight because he was not just speaking as a driver, but also as a GPDA director helping build collective pressure. That meant the concern had already moved beyond something personal or emotional. It had become organized. The reason for that private tension was simple. Closing speeds had stopped feeling predictable. If two cars entered the same section in different energy states, the normal reference points broke down. That was what made teams deeply uncomfortable. Ayao Komatsu's later reaction sounded so strong because Haas had now lived through the very thing people had already been quietly worried about. Once a team principal changes his tone, the story is no longer theory. That is also where the politics hardened. Some teams wanted action. Some teams were naturally cautious because any major reset could disturb the competitive order. The FIA got trapped in the middle, but Suzuka then provided the moment that made it much harder to keep using soft language. Oliver Bearman's crash at Suzuka became the turning point of this story. Before that, criticism of the 2026 rules could still be framed as overreaction or early panic. But when a heavy impact starts getting linked to the same kind of risk drivers had already been warning about, the entire tone of the debate changes. Suzuka changed everything because it turned fear into a real incident. Bearman's 50G impact was already serious on its own, but the context around it mattered even more. If one car is in a stronger deployment state and another is in a different energy condition, the approach speed difference can rise to an unnatural level. Speed is normal in Formula 1, but unpredictable closing speed is something else. That is why this incident stopped being just crash footage. It became an argument that there is a core weakness inside the regulation concept itself. After that, soft denial became difficult. Haas could not treat it as just bad luck. Alpine could not ignore its own side of the context. And the FIA also ran out of room. When a warning and a real incident connect this directly, the next step is no longer just about the fix. It becomes about the politics of the fix. After Suzuka, the real fight was no longer going to happen on track. It was going to begin at boardroom level. The question was no longer whether the issue existed. The question became who would pay the price to fix it. Mercedes arrived as the strongest team in the early phase. Antonelli is leading the championship, and naturally no team would want to see a package rewritten too easily if it had understood that package better than everyone else. Red Bull's pressure was far more direct. McLaren were pushing the safety angle. Ferrari's position was not simple either. That is why the April 9th meeting matters so much. This is not some ordinary technical chat. Multiple changes are being discussed there, touching energy use, deployment behavior, and straight line balance. George Russell admitting that safety adjustments are needed gives the conversation extra credibility, because that is coming from a front-running side. Andrea Stella also made sure the issue did not remain just a competitive debate. He pushed it through the safety route, which is politically a much stronger argument, but even then, nothing is simple. Every fix will help someone and hurt someone else. That is the FIA's biggest problem. If it takes strong action, some teams will say they are being punished for understanding the rules properly. If it takes weak action, then every future incident will place an even bigger question mark over the sport. That is why the final consequence is no longer just technical. Max Verstappen has pushed Formula 1 to the point where delay itself has become a decision. It is no longer only about cars feeling awkward or the racing feeling different. It is about whether the sport will protect the vision it sold or openly admit that the 2026 package has drifted far away from what was expected. If the FIA takes real action before Miami, it will be indirectly admitting that the issue was serious. If it hesitates, then the damage will not only hit the track, it will hit credibility as well. The impact of that delay will reach every layer of the sport. Mercedes' early results will always carry a question over whether that edge came from pure understanding or from benefiting from a flawed concept. Red Bull will keep pointing out that the warning was already there. Ferrari and McLaren will keep pushing their own angles around racing philosophy and safety, and incoming manufacturers like Audi, Ford, and Cadillac will all be watching to see whether the future they were attracted into is actually stable or not. That is why Verstappen's role has become so powerful. He did not just criticize the sport, he forced it to look at itself. If Formula 1 acts now, maybe it can still call this chapter a correction. If it does not, then every strange straight, every fresh complaint, and every new scare will drag it back to the same place where all of this began. A warning that came far too early and was taken seriously far too late.